Well, everyone, it's time for us to go and take a look at the iPad mini 2 and see how this specific device holds up in 2023. Now, the funny thing is that this iPad is definitely not really worth it anymore, if I'm being honest, but it actually had kind of a long lifespan if you kind of think about how long this thing lasted. So I think that's actually a very interesting thing. Now, the very first thing I want to state is that this iPad is not worth buying at all, and I would not recommend anybody purchasing this specific iPad. I think it just makes zero sense of doing it. You're much better off buying an iPad that's still supported with software. This thing hasn't really been supported for many years. So I will leave some links to some other iPads I would recommend this year. Links will be down in the description. You can get them from there and you can help support the channel at the same time. Now, starting off with the outside of the iPad mini 2, on the front of this device, we had a 7.9-inch IPS LCD panel. Now, the good thing that I liked about this, iPad panel was that it was actually a pretty decent upgrade coming from the iPad mini 1. So before this iPad, I actually owned the iPad mini 1 and I had a decent time with it, and I switched over to an iPad mini 2 before switching over to their iPad Airs, and I like this panel. I think it looked pretty decent. It wasn't the biggest change of all time, but it was a good panel for sure. The resolution is still very high, 1536 by 2048. That is a very high resolution panel, and although it wasn't 120 Hz and still had some bezel around it, I think it looked pretty good overall. Now, you did have that top bezel, you have the bottom bezel too, which really wasn't that big of a deal, but I would say on the front, it definitely looked better than a lot of other iPads that Apple had at that time. I mean, in 2013, we still kind of had some iPads that didn't really look that great. This one looked really good in my opinion. On the bottom, we had our lightning port, which was awesome. We also had a headphone jack on this iPad too, which is great. And on the back, we had that standard aluminum back, which I think looked good overall. There really wasn't too much to complain about in this specific, the way it looks or anything. Every iPad Apple has made has looked fairly premium. And in my opinion, that's been one of the biggest selling points of buying an iPad over a lot of other Android tablets, in my opinion. Some of the tablets I've owned haven't felt that great. And even in 2013, when you look at tablets like the Nexus 7 and whatnot, the iPad mini 2 definitely felt more premium, which was something I always took, note of. So from that perspective, it's just kind of something you have to keep in mind right there. Now, another thing I want to throw in here is that there was no Touch ID on this iPad. The iPad mini 3 that came out right after this and did bring that. But the funny thing is that iPad, the successor of this, the Mini 3, actually ended up having pretty much the same internals as this iPad. So I think that's why this iPad ended up lasting a lot longer than some people even originally thought of. So it's always been something that's kind of been a little funny. So from that perspective, that kind of covers it up there, if I'm being honest. Now, in the camera department, this thing has a single camera setup on the front and the back. So on the back, it has a single 5 megapixel camera, and on the front, it has a single 1.2 megapixel camera. Now, you can do 1080p video on the back, you can do 720p video on the front, but that's kind of it. This iPad doesn't really have a crazy amount of things going for it in this day and age, but you have to remember when this iPad came out. It came out in 2013. There weren't even a lot of tablets that basically had that type of capability during that moment, like of having cameras. The first iPad didn't have it. The second iPad did end up bringing it, but for an iPad like this that was considered like a cheaper type of iPad, it pretty much had an okay camera setup for sure. Now, I would say this camera was probably more in line with like an iPhone 4 camera, if I'm being completely honest. But the iPhone 4 was only a few years old when this iPad came out. So you have to keep that in mind as well. So it's a lot of funny stuff, a lot of hardware being used from other devices. But I definitely do think at the end of the day, this type of iPad is totally fine, in the camera department when it first came out. But in this day and age, it's really not worth buying. I mean, it's a fairly old iPad when it comes down to it. But one thing I love seeing though is that these iPads have gotten so much better in that type of department. So that's been something that's really been cool to watch, that these cameras, have just been getting better and better basically year after year after year on these iPads. So that kind of covers it up there for sure. Now, moving on to the software and the longevity portion of these iPads. You have to keep in mind these iPads are not going to last forever. Even the latest iPad Pros, the M2 models, they're going to be gone and people are going to forget about them 20 years from now. But these iPads, especially the iPad mini 2, you have to remember that this was a pretty big monumental change, I would say internally, because the iPad mini 1 didn't last as long as this one did. So I say that to say with this iPad, although it's not supported with software anymore, it did last a lot longer in my opinion than I thought it was actually going to last. So just like the iPad mini 4, this mini 2 ended up going from iOS 7 all the way up until iOS 12.5.6. That is a long lifespan for this type of iPad to have. And when you look at it like that, it is pretty crazy how long this iPad ended up lasting. So from my opinion right there, it's just another one of those things to kind of keep in mind. You're going to get this iPad today. It's going to be discontinued. So because of that, there's practically no reason of even thinking about buying an iPad like this at all. You are much better off buying an iPad that is still supported, because that is going to make way more sense than purchasing an iPad like this. So that kind of covers it up there. Now in terms of the actual performance of this iPad, I'm going to say the specs, then I'm going to kind of break down why it was that maybe not as bad as you may think. So it had that Apple A7 chip inside of it with 1GB of RAM. Nowadays, if you even hear a phone with less than an A10 Fusion chip inside with less than 3GB of RAM, it's not a good phone. And I 100% agree with that. But with these iPads, you have to remember when it came out. It came out in 2013. So because of that, you do have to kind of remember that this iPad was coming out on the heels of the iPhone 5S. And this iPad had the same type of chipset inside as an iPhone 5S, but it also had the same amount of RAM as the iPhone 5S as well. So you weren't really missing out too much in that perspective. And that's been something that I've kind of had to remember, is that with this type of iPad, you're still getting you were getting an iPad in 2013 that was on par with the phone that came out that year as well. So just one of those things to keep in mind. In this day and age, though, this iPad is very, very slow. It is a very slow iPad. There's really not too much going for it, if I'm being honest. And you are much better off buying another iPad that is still supported than buying an iPad like this, which has been unsupported for many years and is very, very slow. Even for like a media consumption device, meaning if you're buying this thing just to use as like watching videos or whatever the case is, you are not going to be getting that good of an experience. And I hope you're not buying this iPad because of that, because even then you're just going to have a pretty slow experience and it's already outdated. And on top of that, a lot of applications that could have been supported on this thing are no longer supported because we're on iOS 16 going into iOS 17. So a lot of those apps, you either have to download a bunch of older versions of those apps or they're just outright not supported anymore. So just another one of those things, there are reasons why you probably shouldn't buy this iPad anymore. It also has a 6,470 mAh battery inside too, which is awesome. I love seeing that massive size battery in this type of iPad. And, it was good. It was good for the size and everything. Nowadays, I think it's kind of small considering that our phones are kind of creeping up to that size. And we have like over 4,000 mAh battery. We have like a 5,000 mAh battery on the Galaxy A series and the S23 Ultra. So in terms of everything, what I'll definitely tell you is I definitely do think the iPad mini 2 when it first came out was very decent. It was a very decent, iPad, and I think a lot of people were okay with it. But I think nowadays, actually I would say probably like 3 or 4 years after this iPad came out, it already kind of felt a little bit old. It was already feeling like a little bit of an older device, and I think people were kind of getting, not tired, but they just kind of wanted something new. And I think that's why for many years Apple didn't make a new iPad mini after the 2015 model. But what I'll tell you is that in this day and age, getting something like an iPad mini is great. But I just would not buy the iPad mini 2. It just makes no sense of buying an iPad like this. Like I said, you are much better off buying an iPad mini 5, iPad mini 6, an iPad Air 3, one of those types of iPads that are still supported. This one just doesn't make any sense buying, in my opinion, at all. So in terms of that kind of covers it up there. If you have any other thoughts or questions, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that helps me so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.